quienes nos acompañan en otras partes del mundo. Unos detalles logísticos para empezar. A few logistic details before we start. Traducción simultánea en inglés y español está disponible durante el evento. Si requiere traducción del lenguaje que se está utilizando, por favor presione el símbolo del globo terráqueo en la barra de abajo y seleccione el lenguaje en el que le gustaría escuchar. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this event. If you would like to use it, please click on the globe icon and select the language you'd like to hear. Este mensaje de entrada con la venia de ustedes lo voy a dar en español. Quisiera también recordarles que el evento está siendo grabado para uso público y que miembros de la audiencia pueden usar la función de Q&A, preguntas y respuestas, para enviar preguntas durante el evento. Ahora sí, empezamos. Mi nombre es Mario Picón, director del programa LTRC, Leverage and Transparency to Reduce Corruption, por sus siglas en inglés, una iniciativa conjunta de resultados para el desarrollo y la institución Brookings. Y es a nombre de estas dos organizaciones que les doy la bienvenida a este diálogo sobre flujos financieros ilícitos en la explotación de recursos naturales, con una mirada al caso del oro venezolano. Quiero ante todo darles las gracias por conectarse el día de hoy. Sabemos lo nutrida que es la agenda de eventos y conferencias este fin de año y por lo mismo valoramos mucho el que nos acompañen hoy. Esperamos sea un tiempo provechoso para contrastar ideas e identificar vías para atender retos alrededor de este tema. El programa LTRC funge como un broker de conocimiento en temas de gobernanza y en el manejo de recursos naturales, particularmente en minería, gas y petróleo. En colaboración con agentes locales y o globales, discutimos los retos que persisten, lo que se necesita para solucionarlos, y apoyamos el cierre de brechas de conocimiento y de capacidad de actores, además de identificar oportunidades para testear soluciones propuestas en este proceso de co-creación. El trabajo de LTRC se basa en un par de premisas que tal vez a primera vista pueden resultar simples y hasta obvias, pero claramente implican importantes retos de implementación. Y aquí me voy a disculpar por la sobresimplificación del argumento que voy a esgrimir, dado que el tiempo es limitado, pero encantado de discutirlo más con ustedes en cualquier oportunidad. Lo primero es que la corrupción, y en este sentido nos referimos tanto a la gran corrupción, a corrupción administrativa o a la captura de actores, sea corrupción en general o específicamente en el manejo de recursos naturales, es un fenómeno complejo que típicamente se adapta al contexto cambiante a una velocidad diferente a la de la respuesta desde las políticas públicas, la legislación o acción desde sociedad civil. En consecuencia, la mejor oportunidad que tenemos de hacerle frente a la corrupción es con estrategias que involucren acciones de políticas públicas, acciones desde sociedad civil o desde sector privado, que se complementen entre ellas y que estén diseñadas con una consideración muy clara de las dimensiones del contexto que permitan a la corrupción sostenerse a pesar del esfuerzo de organizaciones como las de ustedes. Nosotros llamamos este marco de referencia TAP Plus y es el resultado de una detallada revisión de evidencia alrededor de esfuerzos de transparencia, rendición de cuentas y participación en el sector extractivo. No solo eso, hace exactamente un año tuvimos la oportunidad de coorganizar un diálogo internacional titulado El futuro de la gobernanza de recursos naturales, cuyas conclusiones se han convertido en piedra angular de nuestras prioridades como programa. Además de la identificación de 5 temas estratégicos, el diálogo hizo claro un llamado a la construcción de coaliciones de cambio, estrecha colaboración entre organizaciones con enfoques diferentes, pero objetivos comunes. Y este es el espíritu que guía la convocatoria a este evento y al taller que le seguirá. Juntar a personas y organizaciones locales, en este caso de Venezuela, de otros países involucrados en flujos financieros ilícitos desde Venezuela y expertos globales, buscar sinergias y promover acción conjunta o coordinada cuando sea posible. El problema de flujos financieros ilícitos involucra a una serie de actores, tanto dentro como fuera del país, que es foco de atención, independientemente del país que sea. Facilitadores regionales, restricciones del espacio a la sociedad civil en Venezuela y en otras partes de la región, falta de información, son solo algunos de los retos. ¿Cuál es el estado del problema para el oro en Venezuela? ¿Cuál es la agenda pendiente y qué acciones concretas en el corto y mediano plazo nos llevarán a completarla? Son los temas que nos abocan hoy y en futuras actividades de esta línea de trabajo. Esperamos que este panel y la discusión que seguirá sea solo el inicio de un diálogo más fluido con ustedes en el tiempo. Reconociendo de antemano las limitaciones que existen en Venezuela para trabajar en temas anticorrupción, los invoco en particular que al discutir los retos pendientes en el flujo de fondos ilícitos, pensemos conjuntamente qué tipo de acciones y de quiénes se necesitan para construir en el tiempo un sistema que permita neutralizar dichos flujos y el tipo de información cruzada que pueda fortalecer el trabajo de sus respectivas organizaciones. Luego del mensaje del señor Duncan Hill, representante de la oficina de FCDO en Caracas, tendremos un panel extraordinario bajo la moderación del señor Ángel Camacho. Hacia las 10:30 de la mañana del este en Estados Unidos, tendremos suficiente tiempo para preguntas y respuestas de los asistentes también. Quiero, por último, reconocer y agradecer a la Fundación DHP por el apoyo que ha dado al establecimiento de la iniciativa LTRC. Sin nada más, bienvenidos y los dejo con Duncan Hill. Mr. Hill, many thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Mario. Just checking you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thanks, Mario. Well, first of all, Mario and everyone, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and a big welcome from a very sunny Caracas. And apologies if my mouth sounds a bit difficult speaking. I had a dental extraction early this week, but it's a delight to be joining you from Caracas today, and of course, as part of this conversation, to talk about illicit mining and, of course, the Arc of Menero. Nicolas Maduro designated the Arc of Menero del Orinoco, or AMO, a strategic development zone in 2016, with the so-called aim to diversify Venezuela's faltering economy, of which its GDP has collapsed some 75% in the last 8 years, as many of you will already know. This biodiverse zone, therefore, which contains some of the world's highest reserves of valuable and critical minerals, including gold, diamonds, coltan, held and indeed holds much promise. To an extent, Maduro's aim was met. Estimates suggest that gold production will hit more than $2.2 billion this year in 2021, which of course is a big number. And to put this into context, it's around 2 to 3 times the value of DRC's, Democratic Republic of Congo, artisanal gold production. So we're talking obviously significant volumes over a long and sustained period. However, the aim has not been met sustainably, nor from a sustainable business practice. Of the estimate gold production, up to 70% of it, we think, could be smuggled out of the country. The Arc of Menero has not then, therefore, and of course, unlocked flows of legitimate capital, nor has it encouraged sustainable mining practices and activities, for example, fair pay and due regard for minimum workers' rights. Instead, the initiative has turned the region into one of the most vulnerable and insecure parts of this country, where approximately 12% of Venezuela's most pristine and biodiverse territory has become a hotbed of one, human rights abuses, environmental destruction, number two, and of course, illicit finance, number three. I understand as well that now, largely if one visits Estado Bolivar, the currency of payment is in gold, a gold leaf, and not even US dollars anymore. Violent disputes, of course, over the control of mines between the periods of 2016 and 2020 resulted in an estimate 149 killings. Thousands of indigenous people have been forced to leave their homes, and annual deforestation within the zone has surged by nearly, we think, 150% between the period of 2015 to 2020. And the constant use of mercury is causing and has caused irreversible damage over a very, very long term, and therefore health of the community and damage to the environment for a very long period. And regardless of Venezuela's political leadership, restoring order in these regions and creating a sustainable industry and correcting the damage done will take years. This is why this is a serious crisis, therefore, that deserves both national and international attention by all of us. Despite the security and logistical challenges that come with working in the Arc of Menero, we've seen some tenacious journalism to be lauded by so many of us, and so much reporting on this significant issue. Some of the panelists today will follow are part of that credible effort, but there are many more who regularly put themselves at risk to make the impenetrable penetrable. Secondly, the OECD's baseline report, which was released earlier this autumn, and we can, I hope you've all got copies of that, has helped give the issue an international platform and will continue to do so, including with the support of yourselves and the support of the Brookings Institution. The OECD for us plays an important and critical role in confronting illegal gold trade through its due diligence guidelines for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. The guidelines provide practical recommendations to assist companies in avoiding contributing to serious human rights, conflict and financial crimes through their mineral purchasing decisions and practices. The same report on Venezuelan gold shed new light on how gold trade functions in Venezuela. It highlighted the vast web of players involved in this illicit trade and illicit sector, and how the networks that facilitate gold smuggling out of the country stretch from the Dominican Republic all the way through to Turkey, and I imagine further beyond. And the guidelines, together with the report, help us move from just doing the talking and to potentially doing much more, where just last month, for example, the US Senate passed a resolution expressing its concern around the rise of illicit mining and gold trafficking in Venezuela. A further bill that empowers the Department of Treasury to take steps against those complicit in mining and moving these illegal or illicit resources. Finally, I'm delighted that fora such as this are bringing people like yourselves together with the most relevant stakeholders to talk about solutions to the crisis. Given the absence of political will to confront the issues by the Venezuelan authorities themselves, this is exactly the kind of action and the type of engagement today that is needed and needed to be sustained. A huge thanks, therefore, to Leveraging Transparency to Reduce Corruption Initiative for all the work that has gone into organising this event today, and hopefully many events over the future. Apologies that I can't stay for the whole session. I've got to go to another meeting from 10:30, but my colleague Vinay Anikat is with us in the conference today. Many thanks to all, and suerte y saludos desde Caracas. Gracias, Mario.
Mil gracias, Duncan. Thank you very much. So I guess that now we're going to pass to Angel Camacho, who will be helping us moderate in this panel. Thank you so much, Angel. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. As I say, my name is Angel Camacho, Angel Camacho, depending on who's listening. I'm an FBI analyst. In 2015, I was the founder of the FBI's illegal mining initiative. At that time, we realized that illegal mining within the Western Hemisphere was one of the biggest developments that we were seeing. And as a trade or background, I'm an organized crime analyst. So what we're dealing here today and what we're going to spend some time speaking about is the exploitation of illegal commodity in a criminal way, which makes it harder for law enforcement and government officials to trace and identify it. It makes it easier for those trying to exploit. Although we're going to spend some time speaking about Venezuela, this is not an issue that just lives by itself. It really covers the whole hemisphere. So we're dealing with that any area on the hemisphere, we see connections. Either it's the area that's being exploited, you have a lot of transshipment points, especially when we're talking about Venezuelan gold, that further obfuscate the real origin of the gold. And then you have countries that actually are the final recipients. In the context of the Western Hemisphere in illegal mining, Venezuela is way more complicated because you're taking a very complex issue and adding 3 levels, dealing with the humanitarian crisis, the political crisis, and a financial crisis, all happening at the same time. When we talk about corruption, corruption is very specific in the country. Although we have corruption issues all throughout the hemisphere, in Venezuela, corruption has really penetrated every single aspect of the government. So now we have the whole of government being exploited and used towards criminal activity that furthers the pockets of those in power, which allows Maduro to remain in power and further corrupt the soul of a whole nation. So we're going to spend some time speaking about how illegal mining looks in Venezuela, what are their challenges, what can we do about it? And we have a great list of panelists today. They're going to help us go through this. So I'm going to start that. The first panelist is someone that I have gotten to know throughout these years, someone that I really admire and love speaking to. So we'll start with Luis Marechal. He's from OECD. Luis, always a pleasure, Luis. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Angel. The pleasure is shared. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this session. I hope you can hear me well and that the camera is not too bad. So yes, I'll have the pleasure to share some of the very high-level findings of the report today in a short presentation. I also wanted to take this opportunity to just very briefly introduce you all to the OECD work on responsible supply chain of minerals. So I'll just share my screen now. I hope everything is going to be okay. Let me know if you can see the presentation.
We can see it, Louis.
Perfect. So I'll go very quickly. I mean, this is nothing new to anyone that the extractive sector is obviously a major source of growth and jobs in a lot of countries, but also tends to be extremely associated with very severe risks. And so as you underlined, this is truly a global issue, nothing that's really related but only to Africa or Asia or Latin America. It's something that's very global and affects all mineral resources, even though we'll be talking about gold mostly today. And within our line of work, we work actually a lot on gold, but it really affects all mineral resources. And as a matter of fact, the OECD published earlier this year a report looking at 40 different mineral supply chains to basically have a look at all the risks that were reported to be in connection with those supply chains. And the major finding of this report is that you find those severe abuses of human rights and economic crimes in all supply chains, basically, to various extents. And those risks affect also to different extent artisanal and small-scale mining, as well as large-scale mining. There has been a tendency over the past 5 to 10 years to focus really on issues in risk related to ASM, as we call it. But we like to remind our audience that there are quite a number of very severe risks associated with large-scale mining as well. Just a snapshot of another previous baseline assessment we had conducted on Sahel in West Africa in 2018. where some of the high-level figures were that there was around 50 tons of gold produced between the three countries, 98% smuggled out, the market value at 2 billion, and about 1 million people directly and indirectly involved in the production and trade of gold. So what's the OECD guidance about? It's a very long, complex technical document, but just to summarize in 2 broad points, it is, as I said, a very technical document that helps companies implement management systems to help them basically map their supply chain and understand where they're sourcing from, and run risk assessments. And when risks are identified in their supply chain, develop mitigation strategies. Of course, there's a very high expectation that companies should report on their efforts and risks identified. So that's the first technical aspect. But overall, the aim of our guidance, and it's really important to keep this in mind, is to support and promote responsible investment in the mining sector in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Since, as we discussed, the extractive sector is, in most cases, pretty much the only productive sector that may help stabilize some of those countries. So it really is an instrument whose philosophy is to help responsible companies invest and remain invested in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. So we, as I said, regularly commission those baseline assessments. We've commissioned 2 series in the DRC, 1 in West Africa and a long series in Colombia in 2016. We have commissioned this one late last year, and the consultancy IR Consilium was contracted to conduct that research. It was done in about 2 to 3 months, which was really remarkable. And we're really happy with the end product. Just to give you a very short idea of the main findings, this is a 50 pages long document, of course, so this is very brief. The processing capacity and reporting suggests that gold production could amount to as much as 75 tons per year. It doesn't mean that production is actually at that level currently, but it can get to that level. And I think it's already a very significant finding as of itself. The main purpose of the report was to be looking at the risks that are connected to the production and trade of gold in the country. And clearly the finding is that at the moment, pretty much all gold that is produced in the country is to various extents associated with conflict financing of non-state armed group and state armed group, so representative of the official army, serious abuses of human rights, and of course serious economic crimes like corruption, bribery, and money laundering. So just to give you a broad idea of how the production and trade of gold is structured, this is taken up directly from the report. The flows of production and trade are going in 2 directions, one titled the centralized flows and the other dispersed flows. The centralized flows are actually, as you can see here in the middle, going through the sort of official system that was set up by the government to capture the production of gold in the country. Important to say that currently there's no large-scale mining operation running in the country. It's all artisanal, but more often small scale, so semi-mechanized. And you can see from, for instance, those cyanidation plants are typically something that you would associate with semi-mechanized production of gold. So that's one supply chain, would say, that ultimately ends in the central bank of Venezuela and then exported legally, important to underline. The other supply chain is what we would call dispersed flows. So that's basically multiple little supply chains living on their own, with gold being smuggled throughout the border, captured by various types of politically exposed people, either from allegedly the political ruling party, the administration, or the army. And so those 2 sort of parallel supply chains coexist and ultimately produce, as we mentioned, up to 75 tons of gold on an annual basis. Talking about in particular the dispersed flows, how the gold is exported through regional supply chains and ultimately reaches, well, basically the international market, it's going through pretty much all the neighboring countries. So you can see Colombia, it's not a surprise, in particular considering the high involvement of non-state-armed group from Colombia in Venezuela gold production and trade, but also Brazil. There was a mention of a high involvement of gangs coming from Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, Panama, and the sort of the surprise to everyone was to discover the extent of the importance of the Dominican Republic as a regional hub for the transit of gold out of Venezuela. So that was really a very interesting finding at that moment. Of course, all those countries are then connected, as I said, to other countries that play a very important role in the global gold markets, where you would find well-established international refiners, either members of the London Bullion Market Association or not, be they established in the US, in Turkey, sometimes in Russia. There was also allegations of connections with the small refiners in West Africa, even though this has to be further substantiated. But this is basically how gold supply chains work, and most international commodity supply chain work. Step by step, the material reaches the international market, and at this stage, it becomes really difficult to trace it back to the point of origin. So these are some of the very high-level key findings, as I said. I think we will have a chance to discuss the recommendations and the needed steps that we all need to take a bit later on in the conversation. I think I'll stop there with this initial introduction. This is a link that will introduce you to our guidance, something that's much more user-friendly, so don't hesitate to click on that. Thanks a lot, Angel.
Merci, Louis. Thank you. Always great to hear you. And I always said that there's two lanes that we need to address when we're talking about this. There's definitely the criminal elements that law enforcement and other agencies have to deal with, but an important part of it is civil society, and there's no one out there that does a better job than OECD. So it's always great to hear you. So we're going to move to our next panelist, Alan Martin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Camacho. I also want to extend a warm thanks to the organizers for inviting the LBMA to speak to this panel. Just a few quick points. The first one really is to underscore the importance of this OECD report. I think it sounds obvious in some ways, but I think it's a very helpful and timely reminder that conflict-affected and high-risk areas exist outside of Central Africa, and I think it's important that we broaden our due diligence lens to essentially to the world, not just to Central Africa, where this whole conversation about responsible sourcing first began more than 10 years ago. I think it also really talks about the need for greater scrutiny about recycled material and country of origin data, particularly from countries that have little or no gold sources, and really asking whether, for example, with Dominican Republic, which only has one industrial mine but was exporting twice the production, really to ask and scrutinize through the entire value chain as to whether those figures are actually realistic and credible. And I think part of this is this issue about recycled and the country of origin data is, part of the question I think is really around definition, and I think the second one is really about classification or misclassification, and that can be partly unwittingly done, or it can also be done if you're a criminal. It can be exploited to hide the true origin of your material. And I think that, as Louis mentioned, with gold, it's very easy after one or two transit points to completely obscure the true origin of material. And I do know there's quite a lot of conversations going on right now. Louis and I participated in one of these discussions last week, where Switzerland and other countries are actually looking at trying to amend the HS codes to make them more accurately reflect the type of material that is being traded. And I think that from the LBMA's perspective, one thing we do is we have the responsible gold guidance, which is aligned to the OECD's 5-step framework and underscores our responsible sourcing program. And we're just coming out with the 9th version of that, of the RGG. And one of the things we've tried to do is actually bring greater scrutiny to recycled material by asking for disaggregated data according to the different kinds of material, whether it's jewelry or industrial scrap, getting a sense of really, better line of sight really into the origins, and also whether those figures are actually an accurate and credible reflection of the trade. The third point that I would make is I think that really enforcement of this kind of behavior is very, very difficult in terms of making a solid investigation against people who are involved in illicit activity. And I think this is partly due to criminals knowing where the government is either absent or has a light touch, and exploiting that weak presence and that vulnerability. And I think it also really is a question that it's not just about industry. I think it's about broadening that and trying to get enforcement cooperation between jurisdictions. And again, this adds to the complexity of making a case, but I think that there's criminals who are engaged in this behavior know that there's very little discussion or cooperation between governments, and they exploit that to their benefit. Just on the final point about how we see this or how we respond to issues such as this. I mean, we were last November we launched the International Bullion Centers Initiative, which was an attempt to understand the different sourcing practices of these the 12 largest trading hubs, and really try and find ways of remedying the lack of synchronicity between these centers. And that initiative is ongoing. We made some recommendations last year to try and address some of these vulnerabilities, but it's a process that's ongoing. But I think it's one that is the first of its kind. Again, the OECD is also having a parallel discussion around that same thing about trying to find ways of harmonizing the policies and the practices of these different IBCs. And I think the final point I would make is that all of this discussion around responsible sourcing is continually in flux, and I think it's never a case of just sitting on your laurels and thinking that because we've come out with one version of the RGG that is fit for purpose for good. I think it has to be premised on, as the OECD does, one of its founding core values is this idea of continuous improvement, and a recognition that the landscape, both the criminal one and the ethical one, is continually shifting, and that as an industry group we have to keep up with that. And I'll leave it for now and maybe pass on to or discuss more in questions.
Thank you, Alan, and for the great work that LPMA does. And Alan touched a very important point that we'll discuss further out. It's how do we know the true origin of the gold? When it comes to the United States and in the customs forms, when it says country of origin, it's not country of extraction. It's just where the shipment is coming from. And that really complicates our ability to really identify what's the true origin of the gold and when the extraction happened, not where this specific shipment is arriving from. So we'll definitely talk a little bit about more as we discuss with everyone else. So I'm going to turn it next to Nelson Bocaranda from Run Ruins. Nelson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Angel. So to understand the phenomenon gold has become in Venezuela, we have to understand that this activity has been around the country for the past 500 years, but only as recent as 7 years ago, this activity took a turn and became the most profitable and most sought after activity for the Venezuelan regime with the establishment of the Arc of Menero Orinoco. The reason is that it is the best and most readily available way, or was the best and most readily available way to bypass sanctions imposed by the US and the EU since 2017. Making gold's origin, as Angel just stated, virtually untraceable. Members of Venezuelan army's highest ranks had assets frozen or could not get enough money out of the country as they did before, so mining was the most profitable and quickest way to turn a profit. Gold mines started popping up across Amazonas, Carabobo, Mérida, and Bolívar states. Monagas and Apure started mining coltan. Violence plays a key factor here, since these are areas that had been under the control of non-state armed groups for the past decade, since they have been contraband corridors for drugs and other goods. Mining not only took off legally, but also illegally. As much as 70% of gold mining, legal or illegal mines, flows out of the country illegally, according to Transparency International's Venezuela's chapter. Groups such as ELN and FARC that have controlled contraband from Colombia through Venezuela played a key role in creating the first routes for illicit flows of gold. But as gold profits soared, so did the proliferation of criminal gangs associated with mining activities. I'm going to share the same screen that I think it was Alan just shared, but just because I want to emphasize on the small red square there, it says armed gangs or bandas armadas. This is an actual map of the zones controlled by guerrilla groups in green, colectivos or non-state armed groups in yellow, and mega criminal bands in red. These are their actions, or whatever actions they have had in the past 365 days. We're talking about 143 actions from the guerrilla, 147 actions from mega bands, from criminal mega bands, and 160 criminal activities related to non-state armed groups. And once we zoom into the Arc of Menero de Orinoco, every single icon you see there is a massacre. That means that more than 4 people were killed in a single event there. So once we see this, let me stop sharing my screen, come back here. Massacres in areas related to mining not only escalated quickly, attacks on state security forces did so too. Today, as much as 35 different organized crime syndicates control illegal mines and the flow of gold from Venezuela to pretty much anywhere. A new mixed breed of businessmen associated with government officials and the army are now flying gold from mines to cities with aerial connections. As many as 20 planes are used to transport gold internally. Tracking these planes has become a difficult task since most of them turn off their transponders to avoid tracking from civilians. Illegal mines are small operations of about 12 people. New investors associated with Venezuela's regimes or politically exposed persons invest in machinery. Local army officials take a cut from the gold extracted as the criminal organizations that offer security and guard the mine from attacks or invasions by other armed groups. These vacuna or this obligatory payment, extortion payment is made so that these guys can operate the local mines. Most of this gold is used internally to pay for an infinite amount of goods. We buy gold shops popped up across Caracas and most major cities, and where gold is gathered, and buyers in most cases send this gold towards bordering towns in the Colombian border and sell them in exchange houses along the border. One of the most interesting cases of laundering through this method is that of shams, which was sanctioned by the US and is reported by the OECD report. This is an exchange house that through a ledger system or a wahala, it could exchange gold for international payments, deposits, or cash that they would give in exchange in Lebanon. Shams even set up yachts or yacht charters to carry money to countries such as Malta and other ports in Europe. We as journalists not only face today severe pressure for the government and persecution, but face new difficulties trying to uncover what has been deemed the regime's top state secret. We're especially focused on human rights violations in the area, as well as the role played by non-state armed groups and the proliferation of violence in the area. We're working alongside IR Concilium and other partners from the region, such as SOS Orinoco and other news outlets to sort of try to keep uncovering what's happening in the region regarding Venezuela's role in international gold flows. Thank you, Angel.
Gracias, Nelson. And Nelson touches another important point. We're talking about civil society, but he talked about criminal organizations, which really have control of this area. And as Nelson mentioned, this is not something new, something we've been dealing with. The problem in the Americas is that there's an over concentration on illegal narcotics. And then a lot of the governments, to include the US, don't really pay attention to everything else that's happening. So at the end of the day, we're dealing with a criminal infrastructure that's been put in place for decades that can really move from one topic to the other. And sometimes we mention that if tomorrow water was a resource that not everyone had access to, same organizations that traffic cocaine or traffic gold would be trafficking water. in Venezuela was really a wake-up call that as soon as food shortages started to happen, who controlled the food shortages? The same people that control every single black market. So we have to see them as the structure they are, not for what they are dealing with at this moment, because that changes depending on what's happening. Thank you very much, Nelson. We'll go to Cristina Borelli from SOS Orinoco, since Nelson mentioned them. And Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers, to Brookings, for hosting this really important event, and for inviting me to highlight, the role of civil society and what is the role of civil society in a criminal narco state like Venezuela. So SOS Orinoco is a civil society organization that I founded in 2018 with a group of experts, mostly inside Venezuela and some of us outside. And this advocacy group has been working anonymously, concealing the names of team members and witnesses due to the high risk of doing this type of research and denouncing in Venezuela. Our commitment from the beginning was to document and create an in-depth diagnostic of the region south of the Orinoco River, and to raise awareness about the tragedy that's occurring, as well as to outline several urgent measures that need to be taken in order to halt this disaster. So I think we were probably the first civil society organization that really started to document in a systematic way to alert and denounce the ecocide that was being ignored by the international media, by large environmental NGOs. I mean, Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, none of these organizations was saying anything about the rumors of illegal gold mining in southern Venezuela. And internally, this was being silenced by fear. So very few journalists, I think Bram Ibis was probably one of the first to start reporting. And he had a near miss. He was very lucky to get out. But there was very little coverage inside and outside of Venezuela. At SOS Orinoco, the few people that came together were outraged by the fact that illegal mining was on the rise in Canaima, and the IUCN and UNESCO were not doing anything about this. They were simply ignoring. So by creating this platform, we brought together a group of experts, very small at first, with diverse skills. So there were geographers, GIS experts, anthropologists, and all of these people have tremendous knowledge of Venezuela. They're still working in Venezuela. And we were able to effectively get very precise information in a technical format that UNESCO would accept. And this started a long and very bureaucratic process to review what was occurring in Canaima. Specifically, why Canaima? Because it's a World Heritage Site, it's emblematic. And we thought, if we can bring attention, the world's attention to what's happening in a World Heritage Site, the home of Angel Falls, which is the highest waterfall in the world, then maybe we can get attention to the rest of the ecocide that was happening in southern Venezuela. So this has started, we started in 2018. We've already made a lot of headway. The Maduro regime has accepted to, supposedly has accepted to receive a reactive monitoring mission from UNESCO to visit Canaima. They have accepted to send a state of conservation of the site by December 2022. And basically, we're forcing the Maduro regime to owe up to the reality of illegal mining inside a World Heritage Site. And that's a very important first step. They have accepted, they don't quibble or quarrel with the fact that there are over 1,000 hectares of illegal mines in Canaima. So this process that started with Canaima, but thanks to grants and funding that I was able to drum up from various foundations and organizations, This process has now led to a publication of 18 in-depth reports on the impact of the Arc of Menero mining policy, because this is a mining policy. It's not just a geographic region, on all of southern Venezuela. So we have 18 reports in Spanish, 10 reports in English. We've sent out 28 newsletters. We have hundreds of thousands of views on Twitter. And we basically use every tool possible: satellite images to quantify and map the mining footprint, open source tools to denounce state secrets, newsletters, databases. We know who receives them, who opens the newsletters, who doesn't open a newsletter. And so we know, who are the diplomats and the politicians and the international activists who actually receive our information. They can no longer say, oh, we don't know. We cannot say anything about Venezuela because we don't know. No, they do know. There's a lot of information out there. And as was highlighted in a recent article in The Economist earlier this year, we're in the emerging era of open source intelligence. And SOS Orinoco, like civil society organizations such as Bellingcat, I'm sure you've all heard of Bellingcat, are being bolstered and empowered by open source intelligence. And we're basically a collective of researchers and citizen journalists. And we collaborate with the professional journalists such as Nelson Bocaranda and his team of amazing, mostly female journalists who are covering this incredible ecocide. So over the past 3 years, SOS Orinoco has been able to raise the profile of the ecocide to a point that important organizations such as the ones around this panel, are discussing this terrible situation, and the regime can no longer hide the situation. And this has also enabled other journalists and local NGOs and academics and civil society and individuals to speak out, denounce, offer testimonials and evidence. I think that the important thing about this OECD report is that the Maduro regime has been systematically graying the entire mining sector in Venezuela by not publishing data and by smuggling gold and the other minerals directly, smuggling them out. But the logic behind this is that if there's no information, if there's no data, no reports, no official reports, it will make it more difficult to denounce criminality, abuse, and corruption. But thanks to open source information, SOS Orinoco and other organizations have been able to expose the specific criminal aspect of the Maduro regime, in this case, environmental crimes. And for years, Chavista and Maduro ministers have been fooling UNESCO and the UN about their pro-indigenous policies, about their environmental policies, but the regime can no longer control or have a monopoly over this information of this very remote and very fragile part of the world. I think just to finish off, I'd like to say that as founder, but also by the fact that I'm been living outside of Venezuela and I'm safely in Washington, DC, I have become the face and voice of an organization that represents the best and the most courageous of Venezuela. I'm the visible face, but I could not do this without the work of these amazing heroes that are producing these reports.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for all the great work that you guys do. And I love might not be the right expression, but you're using ecocide as a way to really describe what's happening, because it's very complex. Even when you're trying to explain it, is definitely the impact to the environment, the impact to human, especially native communities, who sometimes we relive the sins of the past. We're going through this reconquest of the gold, and the same communities where the first victims seem to be the victims now. There's definitely issues with child labor, human trafficking. Read the reports of sex trafficking that happens around this area. So you have a very complex criminal ecosystem that feeds itself and creates more mystery out of it. So that's very important to continue to highlight. So thank you for all the great work that you guys do. And then we're gonna go last but not least to Julia Jansura. So Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angel, and thanks to the organizers of this event. It's great to be with you. I'm here on behalf of Global Financial Integrity. We are a DC-based nonprofit, and our mission is to combat illicit financial flows, particularly those that occur through the international trade system. So I look at this very much from sort of a trade angle. We've been doing a lot of work on illicit financial flows in the gold sector and related to Venezuela. A few months ago, we published our big report called The Gold Standard, which looks at illicit financial flows in the Colombian gold sector and specifically risks of Venezuelan gold being smuggled across the border and then being exported as though it were Colombian gold, a lot of it to the US. We also published a report recently called Financial Crime in Latin America and the Caribbean. There's extensive coverage of Venezuela. We have a full chapter looking at mineral trafficking as well. So there's a lot on that. I think what I wanted to do is share from this research a couple of key takeaways that I think might be useful to contribute to this conversation. The first thing I wanted to point out is that for NGOs working on this issue, there is a systemic issue with opacity in international trade. So for my research, I downloaded an Excel of over 12,000 international trade transactions and was able to go through and sort of manipulate the data, analyze the data, and try to assess where are the red flags for possible illicit activity within the trade data. Unfortunately, this trade data is hard to access. In many countries around the world, trade data is supposed to be publicly available. However, to access it, you have to go through a long bureaucratic process to request it, or you can pay tens of thousands of dollars to access it easily. It would be great for nonprofits and anti-corruption organizations working on this if we could access this data more openly and be able to do this kind of work without going through so many hurdles. The second thing that I wanted to point out is, this is a problem that occurs not just at the mining site. I think that, we can document issues related to labor conditions, human rights abuses, environmental degradation at the mining site, and that is incredibly important. But the problem does not stop there. I think that when we're thinking about the problem and thinking of solutions, we have to think beyond that. So who are the sort of national level traders who are purchasing this gold? Who are the exporting companies who are exporting this gold to international markets? What are the logistics companies that are involved? And then who's buying this gold? In the case of Colombia, when I'm analyzing their international gold exports, I can see clearly that a lot of it is going to the United States. And there are certain companies that are involved time and time again. And so really sort of putting the pressure and holding them to a higher standard I think that we all recognize that the issues with illicit gold are not just at the point of extraction, at the mining site, and that sort of the responsibility to conduct appropriate due diligence needs to be extended throughout the entire supply chain. I'm sure that we all know and recognize that, but sometimes I think it gets a little bit forgotten in the discussion. And then the last thing that I wanted to point out from my research is that I think that there's sometimes a disconnect when we talk about supply chain due diligence. So as I mentioned, I analyzed over 12,000 individual specific trade transactions of gold exports from Colombia. And I was just amazed at what I found. I'll give you a few examples. As recently as 2015, we found that 47% of shipping companies that were listed on Colombian gold exports reported a Cucuta address on their customs declaration, despite the fact that the Colombian region surrounding Cucuta does not actually produce gold, right? I also found many examples of misinvoicing, where the value of the gold trade transaction was manipulated. I found examples of exports that would use a combination of company and individual names. So say that I'm exporting half the time on my customs declaration, I'll say that it's exported on my personal name, and the other half of the time I'll say it's exported under a business name, right? This is a clear sort of red flag. We see companies sharing legal representatives, sharing addresses. We found over 30 companies registered to the same address as Goldex, which according to Colombian authorities was one of the largest cases of illegally sourced gold from that country. We found companies listing addresses that were clearly not legitimate places of business. In one case, I found a company that was exporting millions of dollars of gold to international markets that had its registered place of business listed as a shack with no door, located on a dirt road outside of Cucuta. So this is just clearly not sort of a feasible place of business. We found individuals exporting huge amounts of gold. For the period in question, they exported over 12,000 kilograms of gold, just simply declaring their personal name without any sort of company either involved or declared. So there are just these huge red flags that practically jump from the page when I'm looking at this. And I think that there's sort of a disconnect because the companies who are buying this gold will tell you that they have quote unquote due diligence. And so my question is, what is going wrong with this quote unquote due diligence? Is it a failure to understand red flag indicators? Is it a lack of appetite to really investigate and think through, where this gold is being sourced from? And so in this regard, I really welcome the work by the OECD on, thinking through due diligence more thoughtfully and more completely, and ensuring that due diligence for gold and other metals and minerals is more than a tick box exercise, that it is really a thoughtful and thorough and complete exercise to ensure that we're purchasing responsibly sourced gold. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for your work. And absolutely, you're highlighting something very important. That is, we'll do the narcotics to gold comparison because it's very easy, very simple to do. But when we're dealing with these transactions, they're being commingled with actual legal transactions, which creates a lot of noise. It's really hard to untangle them and really identify what's happening because we have so much flow that's happening all the time. So I appreciate it. And that's something that we'll definitely discuss as we continue our conversation. So reminder to our participants, I get the pleasure to ask the first questions to our panelists, but anything that you guys have that you want to ask, the Q&A is there for you. So you can start putting your questions there as we continue this conversation. So one thing that I think is a challenge, so this is the 6th, 7th year of the initiative for us, and it's the issue of awareness. I think it's something that we continue to struggle after having major cases and a lot of movement towards the understanding of the trade. I still find myself having those conversations explaining what's illegal mining, it's happening in the Americas, and it's hard. So I want to open it for all our panelists. How do you see the issue with awareness, which you might see that I think we all share the problem that the awareness is not at the level that any of us would like it to be. And what can we do to then create even larger awareness so we can start moving the ball that way? So we'll go in the same way that we started. So Louis, you can go first, and that way we'll give the rest of the panelists some time to think on their answer. So Louis, awareness, what can we do?
Thank you. Well, it's a constant battle, I would say. Always reaching out to new people and coming back to those that you already talked to, making sure that they really understand what's the situation and the extent of the issue. Just want to take a parallel. I've been leading our work on West Africa, for instance. I was talking about this report in 2018, which highlighted the increasing interference of terrorist organization in West Africa. And at that point in time, I thought it would create a sort of a shock, in particular in our constituency. The point is that 3 years on, it's still pretty much not the case, and awareness is very low on those issues for West Africa. I see a different story for Venezuela still, to be honest, much more interest from governments and companies and civil society organizations. But I think it's just a matter of being consistent and coming back again and again as much as we can in this kind of event. Of course, reaching out to the political level is absolutely key, and the resolution of the US Senate on this point can make a very clear difference, because ultimately I believe this is where the rubber hits the road. Not forgetting, of course, the very good work of our partners in the private sector, but obviously, as the point was raised, there is still an issue with the quality of due diligence. Otherwise, we wouldn't be faced with that kind of question. So yeah, it's constant efforts, I would say, and being sure that that the message goes through very clearly.
Thanks, Louis. Alan, anything on that you guys experience as you have conversations from MPI?
Yeah, thank you. No, I think there's a bunch of issues that I'd highlight. I think there's definitely this issue of due diligence. Julia is completely right in her assessment of the need for refiners and exporters and everybody in the value chain to do that. And I think that's the OECD again is premised on that idea about going back to the source, going as far back through the supply chain as you have to, according to risk, and try and get line of sight of your supply chain. And I think that's something that is still needs to be worked on. I think there's also sometimes we have every refiner in the LBMA good delivery system has to take an annual audit, independent audit, and those audits are assessed by myself and my team. And I think a lot of times we find auditors who, might well have experience in other commodities and not particularly up on the risks and vulnerabilities of the gold supply chain. So that's something that we're doing continually. We're improving the knowledge base of those auditors to try and sensitize them to the vulnerabilities in the gold supply chain. And I think the final thing is also the question of risk mitigation. That's something that I think has not really happened enough. I think most times refiners or anybody in the gold industry would like to essentially have a perfect, clean bill of health of their supply chain. They don't want to admit perhaps that there are vulnerabilities in the supply chain. And so they gloss over those things as opposed to actually being very upfront about saying, yes, we are sourcing from a problematic area, or we have a supplier who might have done something, but we're working with that supplier to improve their behavior. And I think that's another element of this that hasn't perhaps been given enough attention. I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Alan. Nelson, we're going to go Nelson, Christina. I'm sure they're going to share the frustration, but how many times do we have to tell you this? I've been doing it for years and you're still not paying attention, but Nelson, go ahead. What are the challenges you guys are getting?
You're mostly right. We've been covering this from as far back as 6 years ago, trying to bring awareness on Canaima, on specifically ecocides there. We've been you talked about overlapping of this illicit economy with others, and we've been bringing awareness on this subject, on how it disrupts different factors that just have daily life and routines in these economies, such as indigenous people that live there, the international companies involved in this trades, which Julia mentioned. And so now what we're trying to bring the focus on is on the massacres, the killings that are happening in these areas, because this is such a sensitive subject that escapes from public opinion here in Venezuela. Most of our media is censored. Most of the outlets that try to publish this information either are persecuted, closed, or the journalists jailed or detained or persecuted by government forces. So it is hard for us to bring awareness. What we need to bring more awareness to this is trying to get more funding for our investigations. I think Christina talked about OSINT, open source intelligence. That plays a key factor in us getting our hands on information that has been mostly obscured by government forces. So it is an uphill challenge for us to bring more awareness on these subjects. And I think overlapping these areas of interest and all of the illicit economies that take part in Venezuela, and trying to channel them through the gold flows, which obviously play an incredible role here, is part of that challenge.
Thank you, Nelson. Christina, you named the organization SOS for a reason, so let us know, what are your challenges when it comes to awareness?
Yeah, so I see, two levels. One, as Louis mentioned, the work that OECD is doing, that the US government is doing, the fact that there's this Senate resolution, the Spanish Congress also put out a resolution. So I think that we're gaining traction at that level, government, okay? And making sure that the supply chain, that people are aware of this. I think where we're really having a lot of trouble still is at the level of consumers and activists. So, the consumers nowadays are very concerned about, what they're eating and where it's coming from. So they need to start, worrying about where the minerals that they're wearing or, in their phones, where those minerals are coming from, how they're being sourced. And I think that consumers can be mobilized in a big way, just as they've been mobilized regarding food. They have to be mobilized in that regard. And I think that's starting, but a lot of work needs to be done. And then the other piece is the activists, the environmental activists. You hear, as Venezuelans, every time I hear about Brazil, I get very annoyed, because not that Brazil is great. I'm not saying that Brazil is great, but what's happening in Venezuela is 10 times worse than anything that Bolsonaro's doing just over the border. And none of the big environmentalists and the big activists in the environmental world say anything about Venezuela. So, it's a little bit of a double standard. And I think, it's a question of information, education, but also shaming. We have to make people aware that what's going on in Venezuela is much worse. And we also need to shame the Venezuelan government, the regime. And just as we've shamed them into accepting what's going on in Canaima, we have to force them to accept that what's going on in Canaima is going on in the entire southern region of Venezuela.
I can feel your pain in your voice. Absolutely. Thank you, Christina. And then let's see, who am I missing? Julia, I'm sorry. Same question. You're coming from a different perspective, but as your report goes out and you try to make people aware of the work that you guys doing, what issues are you guys having with creating some awareness for your work?
Yeah, I think that, maybe taking a step back, I think that one of the things we're trying to raise awareness regarding is not just the issue itself, but how we can go about investigating these kind of issues using transaction level trade data. So we have had dozens of trainings with civil society, with journalists. We've had numerous trainings with Latin American governments, with financial intelligence units, for example, about how they can use transaction level trade data to really investigate what is going on in these cases. It is a great methodology. It's a great resource, and many people simply don't know that it's available to them. We can use sort of the transaction level data to recreate the story of where that gold is coming from. And of course, a customs declaration is not perfect. It's not going to tell us everything, but it is going to leave us very powerful, very interesting clues about the origin of that gold. And clearly we can expand that to other types of commodities as well. For example, we've done research looking at illicit timber in Colombia. It's a fascinating story. And so really promoting, raising that awareness of why we need trade data, how we can use it to really ensure greater integrity in our country's trade transactions.
Thanks, Julia. And I think one of the issues that we had since the beginning is that there's a very important environmental component, and not everyone's on the same page when it comes to that. So depending on which audience you're trying to reach, some people are just not as open as they should be to that important component, and it becomes challenging. It's becoming about how you frame it, then how you talk about maybe the illicit flows or what's happening in the government. And because Christina said about shaming the Venezuelan government, I'll give the group this next question. So in our experience, we had a lot of successes when we partner with other countries. This is a very complex puzzle that not everyone has all the pieces, and we need to work together. And all the successes, all the cases that we've been able to move forward, it's because we had the foreign partner working with us and bridging that information. What do we do with the government that's not willing to play ball? I mean, the sanctions are a double-edged sword where we have painted them into a corner that now they're only dealing with the people that we don't want them to deal with. So how do we engage a government that sees us as the enemy, and how do we bridge that gap? And I know this is a little bit more complex, but Louis, you can go first.
That's indeed a very complex question, Angel. I mean, it really is difficult. I mean, I don't think it's possible to really directly engage this government on this specific issue in isolation. Probably this has to be dealt with alongside many other points. Indirectly, I would tend to think that already making it harder for the government to make benefits out of this gold trade would probably provide some leverage for discussion and negotiation. Clearly, for the moment, the government hasn't had any issue trading this gold held in the central bank, and applying a bit more pressure on this point, in particular coming from the private sector, the global one, might help create an environment for discussion around this issue. But clearly, I mean, I might be proven wrong, but I doubt that just choosing to talk about gold only with the government would be successful. I think that would be too ambitious.
Thanks, Louis. Alan, any solutions to this very complex issue?
Well, it's a really tough one, because when you have intransigent governments or partners that don't want to play ball, it's very hard. I mean, I would say that there's a one thing I think does require this sort of holistic approach, because I think there's been the parallel to sort of squeezing a balloon, that if you squeeze it, then it sort of goes in different directions. If you clamp down on one area, it moves to another jurisdiction. So I think a lot of it is really trying to emphasize the education role for exporters, getting a better sense of putting pressure on people to really ask them, have you done the due diligence? And from our part with the refiners, we can certainly leverage refiners. We have the ultimate sanction that if they are found to be in breach of their responsible gold guidance, and the OECD Annex 2, which lays out the most serious violations, including forced labor and corruption and illegality of that kind. We can remove them from the good delivery list, but I think there's still jurisdictions, for example, where we have this with, and this is part of the IBC work, the International Bullion Centers that we're trying to work on, is that trying to have this sort of common approach amongst all the trading centers, because it doesn't matter whether the balloon is squeezed, the gold will still eventually hit a wall where it can't go further down the chain. And so I think it does require really that effort by governments especially to really put pressure on trading centers to get serious about this issue.
Thank you, Alan. Nelson, what do you got for us?
So I'm not really want to talk about policy, but I do understand the role that you can't make the Venezuelan government do pretty much anything, but then you have the stepping stones where gold is getting to. And I think that's where you can actually some sort of choke the trade on gold, which are the Antilles, Dominican Republic, Panama, Brazil, and even Colombia, which are key players in the flows of gold from Venezuela towards other places. So I believe that the right place to choke the illegal gold trade would be those, instead of just talking about Venezuela not being on board or taking any action on this. And I think that you guys are about to get a trove of information from Alex Saab, who is now under US detention, and he might give out very useful information about the bigger gold flows that we might not even have on the radar right now. This guy was stopped in Cabo Verde to fuel his plane going all the way to Congo to try to get some refineries on board. And he played a key role in exchanging gold for food, gold being sold at international prices and food being sent back to Venezuela with a steep overprice of almost more than 100%. So I think that we are about to get more information on the bigger web the illegal and legal gold flows from Venezuela are getting through SAB. And well, the answer to the question about choking is on those stepping stones gold takes from Venezuela before arriving elsewhere.
Good. Sina.
Yeah, I mean, talk about choking. Guyana already is feeling the pressure. I understand that there's a Canadian mint and a German company that have stopped buying gold from Guyana because they fear that there's Venezuelan tainted gold mixed in with the Guyanese gold. So I 100% agree that you have to start shutting off those choke points. But I would say that back to the OSINT, the open source intelligence. This is I believe from the SOS Orinoco point of view, we've published 28 in-depth reports, and these are fact-filled. I invite you all to visit our website. These are 50, 75-page reports with mapped, geo-referenced evidence of what's going on in southern Venezuela, and this is absolutely factual. The regime cannot deny it. And in the case of Canaima, they accepted our numbers. So I feel that we're starting to have an impact with the regime. Just in Canaima, that obviously, because we were able to take this to UNESCO, and we got UNESCO involved. But we can start doing the same thing in other protected areas, such as Yapacana, Parque Nacional Caura, Alto Orinoco, which is the home of the Yanomami, and we're now getting testimonials of 50 or so mines by with garimpeiros from Brazil. So there's a lot of information out there, and I think that if we publish this, and it's already published, if we get coverage, it is a way of shaming the regime.
Thank you. I know, and Julia, I know this is a little bit more complicated, but anything that you want to add to what we have discussed so far?
I'll just echo some of the other comments that have been made. I agree with a lot of it. I think that, we need to do more working with those stepping stones, I think as someone referred to them, working with countries like Colombia, Panama, the Dominican Republic. I think that there's more that the US can do there. I will also suggest, I think there's more the US can do on the US side. When I mapped out those 12,000 trade transactions, I was able to identify transactions that were clearly fraudulent, clearly illicit. And you can easily trace those to US companies. In fact, the US was the end destination for over 60% of those transactions. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done here. I think that the implementation of beneficial ownership in the US and having more clarity about the real owners of those companies involved will be a very important tool that hopefully law enforcement can use to really crack down on the illicit gold issue from the US side as well, because as you rightly mentioned, I think that our hands are a little bit tied in terms of our ability to address this within Venezuela, unfortunately.
Yes, and yeah, it's an issue that everyone is part of the issue, part of the solution, and we have to address it. And beyond, it's, let's say Maduro gets COVID or something, dies. The transition in the government, it's not going to stop this. You have ELN and FARC controlling a lot of the areas. And if you look at these organizations, the Colombian government, with a very stable government for many years, with a lot of help of the US, had challenges to deal with organizations. Imagine when you place those organizations in a very chaotic environment. So this is something that we'll be dealing with a very long time. So before we switch it over to a Q&A with our participants, one last easy one. No, it's a hard one too. One thing that we talked about is how do we trace the origin of the gold, because that's one of the biggest challenges that we're dealing with. And unlike with diamonds, you can polish cut them, but you cannot take 5 diamonds and make a bigger diamond. Gold allows you to change it and mix it. You can have a gold bar that arrives to the US that half came from illicit source, half came from illicit source. And this is a conversation I had with Louis plenty of times, and I think is an issue that is at the center of how we start breaking down, because we can prove without any doubt that yes, this gold bar came from this region. We just are not there on the science part. We can mark it from the mine to trace it, but once we get in the US without that marking at the beginning of the source, it's hard to. So I know there's no solution, and this is a conversation that we have all the time, but Louis, anything on the, how do we crack the part of knowing exactly where the gold came from? Because without that, we're in the negative dealing with this.
I think if you look at it from the supply chain side, you might not be able to trace it back to the final origin, but that as of itself should be maybe a good enough reason for a company to disengage from the supply chain. Say if you're sourcing from an exporter in Colombia and that you're repeatedly reaching out to him to have more information on the sources of that gold, if he constantly refuses to let you know where he's sourcing from, and to let you know if he has conducted any sort of risk assessment, as a responsible actor and a responsible buyer, at some point you should stop. You should consider stop sourcing from that exporter. So the objective is not absolutely necessary to identify the origin of the gold, but as a responsible buyer and actor, if you don't feel comfortable at all with the information that you're being provided by your supplier, at some point you should consider disengaging or suspending your relation. And I think this doesn't necessarily imply a lot of technology, a lot of costs that may be associated with the technological solutions that are available even for gold. I found out recently, but they are only accessible to large companies. But just like, using your brain and figuring out that if your supplier is not disclosing information in spite of your repeated requests, there might be a good reason for that. So that's what I was alluding to when I was saying progressively, close the sort of exit routes for the gold out of Venezuela goes through that kind of behavior. Like any international buyer sourcing from Latin America, or at least from neighboring countries in Venezuela, need to have this at the back of their mind.
Yeah. Thank you, Louis. And absolutely, the gold prices and the degree that comes from how much money you can make now. And we saw how COVID created a new record for how high the gold prices are, creates an incentive for those who maybe want to follow the rule of law to be more flexible and easily more corruptible. Alan, I'm sure this is something that concerns you guys. So anything on your side about how do we have the idea where the actual gold came from so we are secure? Because one of the things that we've talked about, we never want to be in a situation that the US or any country, an investigation finds out that some gold bar sitting on their mint or in their vault, it's directly linked to a criminal organization, or any banks for that matter would want that. So what do you have, Alan?
Well, I'll certainly echo what Louis just said about closing exits and severing relations with suppliers who can't demonstrate beyond a doubt the origin of the material. I think Louis also might have been referencing on the technological front that Metalor, which is a big Swiss refiner, created this geoforensic tool that actually does allow you to essentially do a DNA on the gold right down to the mine site. And so even if there's one where you have a concession here and the gold comes from another gold stream, they can tell the difference between even that kind of close proximity. It is open source, but it does require other users to set up a database to actually start getting samples of different mine sites, so you can actually have a credible spectrum to test against. So I think that's a very key breakthrough that was only announced, I think, about this March, last March. So it's a new field. It's growing, but I think it's promising in that respect. I think the problem also is really around coming back to this issue of recycled and bringing greater scrutiny to it. And there are things that we can do as the LBMA is doing, where we're trying to get a greater line of sight, trying to disaggregate, creating a better, statistical understanding of what is credible or not. But that takes time, and it's a bit imperfect. But I think there is a move by a lot of industry partners, downstream partners, whether it's tech companies or jewelers, where they are making a conscious choice to source only recycled material because they believe it is, one step removed from the artisanal mining or mercury use or these kinds of things. And they're actually billing it sometimes as being environmental, an environmental kind of form of gold. And I think that issues like this that we're seeing in Venezuela and elsewhere, where we can see the laundromat of gold going through the recycle system, really does, I think, require a broader discussion with those companies that are making these ethical claims about recycled material and actually not doing enough due diligence on the source. So I think there's again, to this issue of public awareness, I think there's a lot of that needs to be done as well.
Thank you, Alan. So we'll switch to Nelson. I know you guys are on the other side. You're in country. So highlighting where the flows are leaving, because you're in that position to see where the gold is flowing, might help identify it. But anything on your side, Nelson?
Not really. I'm taking notes down on metal ore and their open source technology to see like the DNA from this. But well, our role is just to raise the red flags and say, look, these are the routes these guys are taking. These are any innovations in those routes that these guys are finding all the time, ways to just amaze us with what they're doing to deliver gold from Venezuela elsewhere. Like, I think it was Julia who talked about timber. We're seeing people here just put gold into timber and ship timber from the ports. And then that timber gets transported from one ship to another in an open sea. So our role is trying to get those red flags to whomever might take any action on this. But besides that, I've got nothing here on him.
No, I understand. And yeah, they never lack creativity. We have seen this time and time again, to the point that we haven't seen in the Americas, but I know from spending time at OECD meetings, same as they're ingesting it to be able to use mules. Creativity is not something they lack. And of course, the concern is that we clamp down. There's always someone that's not gonna have any scruples that really wants to take advantage. They'll come and still buy it at the end. So you block the legal market or the part that we control, and you have other countries around the globe that might take this as an opportunity to still get there. So the money continues to flow. They get the advantage. That's something that it's never stopping. Christina, I know this is challenging from what perspective you're coming from, but anything that you want to add to that hard question?
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add except, obviously contribute to awareness and making noise. One thing that we haven't talked about here, and I just want to flag and put out there, is the amount of mercury that is being smuggled into Venezuela in order to produce all this gold. And that was highlighted in the OECD report as well. But we're seeing, and we're getting testimonies from people saying that it's the armed forces, of Venezuela, who are smuggling all of this mercury, which is illegal in Venezuela. By law, it's illegal to use mercury, and yet we're seeing huge amounts of mercury coming in through Guyana, by air from Peru, from the DR, and this is, we're starting to look at mercury in the rivers, mercury in indigenous communities. We just published a report on that. Correo del Caroni just published a report on mercury, and this is another incredibly, alarming aspect of this gold, blood gold situation.
Well, yeah, and we have seen movements from the global governments to really control the supply of mercury due to the Minamata Accord. And as soon as that happened, we started to see black market for mercury popping up in the hemisphere, especially when it comes to Mexico. And those flows, narcotics flowing one way, mercury flowing the other way. So we're dealing with that structure already, like I mentioned, that can move anything. And our ability to evolve as fast as they do, it's harder because governments will have 10 meetings in a committee before they can decide something. The organization decides to do it today and might be able to already put it into practice tomorrow. Thanks. Julia, you are the last one. You've seen it from the flows and how you identify things. How about better identifying where the gold comes from? So when we go to do a seizure or to take it to court, there's no doubt that what was seized is actually illicit in nature.
Yeah, thanks, Angel. It's a great question. It's a difficult one. I think we've seen certain countries have success with being able to analyze the gold for purity. For example, I know that Chile has been able to analyze the gold and see, we know in Chile that we don't produce this kind of gold. Therefore, so it is sometimes possible. As you say very rightly, it's difficult and it's not always possible. I think that given the difficulty around analyzing the metal itself, I will suggest a different question that we can ask that I think will help us. And that is the question, who is benefiting from its sale? And so to go back to my anti-money laundering language, the identification of the ultimate beneficial owner, that real person who is benefiting from the sale of the product, that gives us important clues about the origin of the product. So if I can analyze not just the name of the company, not just the lawyer who registered the company, but the real person who's benefiting and making money from the sale of that gold, I might be able to see, is that person associated with a criminal group? Is that person associated with a terrorist organization, which is unfortunately sometimes the case? Is that person associated, is that person a sanctioned person, or are they associated with a sanctioned entity? So, asking that question of, who is that beneficial owner? Who is benefiting from the sale of that gold? It's not quite as good as knowing exactly where the gold came from, but it's pretty good. It gives us some good clues about the sourcing of that gold.
Yeah, and absolutely, the challenge of money laundering in court is always a very hard charge to give. Some prosecutors might shy away from it because it's very complex to explain to a jury money flows and how we identified X or Y. So Julia, since the first question came to you, so we'll stay with you. I know you received it, but I'll read it real quick. For Julia, how is the Venezuelan gold arriving to Colombia? Armed groups use migrants to smuggle the gold into the country, or there are flights taking the gold across the border? So
yeah, so what our research suggests, and again, it's very difficult when you're talking about an illicit movement of gold or any other asset, but what our research suggests is that gold is being transported via land, that some of it is coming through sort of informal border crossings via land, others is going through formal border crossings via land. It's very easy to move illicit gold through a former border checkpoint because it's so small, right? Something that's so small you can put in your pocket can be so valuable. Whether that is being transported by migrants, I will hate to hazard a guess. I'm concerned that saying something like that can have very negative humanitarian impacts for people who are fleeing from persecution, extreme poverty, who are in desperate straits. I will say that there's a lot of people traffic across the border between Colombia and Venezuela. Some of it is migrants, some of it is criminals, some of it is traders. You got all sorts of people moving, and so I wouldn't want to hazard a guess. But yes, I do believe it is moving via land.
Absolutely.
Can I jump in on that?
Absolutely.
So once the government started paying some of the things that they were buying, such as food, they do a handout of food here in December. They give out pieces of pork, and they paid those people with gold. And the way that gold goes to Cucuta is through land. They just make up a convoy of several vehicles with highly armed men that travel all the way from Caracas to the border and just get, since the official border was closed off, they go through trochas. So we're talking about 20 to 30 heavily armed men that move from Caracas to the bordering states in armored vehicles and carry as much as anywhere from 20 to 40 kilograms of gold in 3 or 4 kilogram bars across the border and sell them in those exchange houses in Cucuta.
Thank you. And absolutely, the other thing, when we're dealing with Venezuela, you have to remember that the whole government is working towards this illegal activity. So if they need to clear a flight, there's no one to get in the way of that. In other countries, you would have to have a corrupt government official, but the whole government is corrupt at this point. So if they need to move it across the border or plane, the plane's not going to be inspected. The plane's not going to stop. So it's going to clear for takeoff wherever it's going. So we have to, this is what makes this activity, which we see all around the hemisphere, even more complex when we're dealing in Venezuela.
And that's just Colombia. Once you get flights out of Venezuela with a transponder off, you can pretty much land anywhere. And these guys are buying the best jets that you can get your hands on just to get more of flight coverage to get to areas where there's even less control than the neighboring countries.
Thanks. Anyone else in the panel that wants to chime in on this question? Go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, I think we also need to look at what's going on, you know, on the river, well, the Orinoco, and as towards Guainía. So remember that Yapacana National Park is like a FARC fiefdom surrounded by the Ventuari River, the Orinoco River. It's completely sort of independent there. And the FARC and ELN, they kind of go back and forth, but basically they control Yapacana, and they're getting gold out of Yapacana via the rivers. So don't forget about the rivers and how the ELN and the FARC are using waterways into Colombia as well. Also in Autana. So here I'm talking about Amazonas state, where mining sites are much smaller. They're not big open mines like in the state of Bolívar. And the way of getting in and out is via the rivers, but they're also receiving technical and logistical support from the Guardia Nacional, because some of these mines are on top of the Tepuy. So on top of Yapacana mountain, they are mining. And this is happening in other places like Aracamuni and so forth. And SOS Orinoco has reported in great detail on you know, kind of the mechanism of this kind of mining in Amazonas.
Thank you, Christina. Sid, I have a question since you're there. Someone asked, how can we ensure that focus on the UNESCO side doesn't push mining into the other areas, which is always a concern. We put pressure on one side, but the activity moves to the other. So as we not only react, but think ahead, anything that you guys are doing in that area of planning, okay,
well,
hear what's next.
I mean, that's exactly why we've done all these other reports on the impact of the Arc of Menero on all these protected areas in southern Venezuela. So, you know, if you can imagine the map of Venezuela, 60% more or less of the national territory is south of the Orinoco River. And of that, we have the Arc of Menero, which is 12%. But this is a mining policy that goes, it's not circumscribed to the Arc of Menero. This is a mining policy that is, you know, for the entire country. Even as I think Nelson mentioned, even in places like Yaracuy, Carabobo. So basically, the regime is promoting this kind of just chaotic mining all over Venezuela and in other protected areas. And that's why it's so important to report on what's happening in all these protected areas. The irony, for example, is that Nicolás Maduro created a new national park, which is Caura National Park. It's huge. It's much bigger than Canaima. And yet he is also promoting illegal mining in El Caura, on the rivers of El Caura. So it's this complete double standard. The regime thinks that they can declare a national park and at the same time do illegal mining, and that nobody's going to protest. Well, that's why civil society is here. That's why these journalists are here. That's why we have to keep, you know, eyes on what's going on.
Thank you. Yeah. Applying logic to the decision, it's something that will give you a headache. So it's easier to try to avoid it. I have another one, and then Christina, you can go first, and then Nelson. Someone wanted to know what kind of outreach is being done with Native communities to contribute to either reporting, data collection, or just activism as a whole.
Yeah, so the impact that the Arc of Menero policy is having on indigenous communities is really tragic, because it is basically driving a wedge into indigenous communities, pitting indigenous brothers against others, the pro-mining indigenous people against the anti-mining indigenous people. So within one community, such as the Pemon, or maybe the Piaroa or the Sanima, these communities, in general, the elders, in general, not always, are kind of against mining. And the younger people, the younger indigenous people who have difficulty finding work, who are basically going hungry, they want to go to the mines. So we're having this sort of confrontation amongst indigenous people because of mining. And this is a tragedy because it's basically dividing them. It's creating rifts. These people are losing their cultural heritage as they go to the mines. And I think that's another, I mean, apart from the ecocide, this is probably the most tragic aspect of this mining policy.
So one of the biggest things that surprised us when we went to cover Canaima, what was happening in Canaima, was the involvement of indigenous people in these illegal mines that are pretty much draining the water out of the Canaima Lagoon, which is what is protected as a World Heritage Site. When you ask them why they're involved in this illicit activities, what all of them say is, this is our only means to get any money and to feed our families. This also got exacerbated by the pandemic. Once Venezuela closed completely, there was no internal traffic or tourism. Canaima started having a thriving tourism economy, opened up, I think, a little less than a year ago. So we still have to find ways to finance those communities through tourism so they can steer away from mining, and specifically from just killing the only source of food they can have indeterminately in time, which is tourism. It's part of getting people on the ground to teach them on how to just save their environment so that they can flourish as a tourism site eternally, instead of just having a profit, a once-off profit through illegal mining in balsas, in rafts, in the adjacent rivers to Canaima.
And that's one of those challenges when you go out and speak to people. Are you aware of the environment, all the impact, everything that's happening? But their mindset is, I'm trying to survive day to day. I don't have time to think about next year because I need to think about today. And that's hard to get that message.
We might see them a bit more involved once mercury gets into their family's bloodstreams and start having problems with that. It's terrible to say, but I think that would be the biggest turning point for them.
And let's hope it doesn't get to that. Absolutely.
Let's hope so.
Alan, I know that it skipped you, going back to you, so I'll send you the floor so you can chime in.
Yeah, no, thank you. I just wanted to come back to one of the points that Julia made earlier about the importance of ultimate beneficial ownership and understanding who the key actors are. And again, one of the changes we made to the responsible gold guidance was to drop the threshold from 25% to 10%. And this is, to my knowledge, one of the lowest UBO thresholds within industry groups. And it's lower than the FATF and others that recommend, which is usually the 25% threshold. But I think we did this because there were many instances where we had refiners, for example, that were found to have, maybe a 5% or some kind of somebody inside their shareholder structure or supplier, which was below the 25%, which nevertheless was going to cause reputational damage to the company, to the refiner. And so I think this is an example of the kind of continuous improvement, the inching slowly towards closing off the free-for-all that some individuals have acted with. But I think it's one small step towards that goal of trying to create greater awareness and openness to who is involved in these companies.
Thank you. We almost coming to an end. Let me see if we have any other pending questions. Okay, give me one quick second. We're gonna bring someone in to chime in 1 minute. We're waiting for a new panelist, last minute panelist, or to bring us to the closing portion.
Okay.
To clarify, Angel, it's to answer one
Yes.
focus question. Here you go, David. The question on Minerven, I don't know if you can read it out, Angel.
I do. You have in front of you, Louis? I have a.
Yeah. So in the flow diagram about gold flows, Minerven appears to be an important actor buying from gold actors and also from ASM Mining. To what extent is it also directly involved in production, and has its current capacity been decimated as with PDVSA? And David, which was our consultant on this report, I think is best placed than I would be to take that question. So David, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, happy to weigh in there. Thanks for having me in for this. Our research has indicated that Minerven is in fact a shadow, you might say, of its former self. Its function now is mainly as a sort of warehousing and distributing entity for the centralized flows that are coming in the form of crude material from some of the small mines and some of the other stuff being sold into the centralized flows. So it plays that sort of administrative role, but in a very pared down way. I think it's fair to say that the Maduro government has really yet to encounter an extractive industry, a parastatal in the extractive industries that has not run into the ground. But the upshot is that while it is involved in moving some of the production, our research indicates it's not at all directly involved in extraction. And it's certainly not directly involved in the dispersed flows that leak out of the country before ever entering into the centralized flows. That said, I would also point out that when we talk about dispersed flows, there are dispersed flows that are visible in the flowchart that leave the centralized flow. Primarily, we believe, through the activities of politically exposed persons. And Minerven, as a sort of hub and facilitator of that centralized flow, would be steering some gold to the individuals or entities that would be sending that gold abroad rather than to the central bank.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the work you guys did on the report. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Sadly, we are coming to the end of our time. This is a topic that we could spend today and the whole week speaking about. As we highlighted, it's a very important topic that a lot of work needs to continue to happen. We definitely have two big streams. Civil society has a very important part on raising awareness, creating, putting pressure. Law enforcement and governments have to address those working in the criminal sector. But it's a very complex issue one that we're going to be dealing with years to come. So this is not something that's going to end up any moment. And we have people suffering at the same time. We discuss who are paying the price of this, those native communities, the people actually working at the mines, not because they want to, because they feel they have no other way out. And as Julia talked about, the burden of this activity is those who really are benefiting from that, either the high government officials or the companies that end up taking advantage of what's happening just to have better profits. So I want to thank all our panelists for not only spending the time and sharing some of your knowledge with us today, but all the good work that you guys do. And I hope that you continue to be healthy and have many years of continuing the good fight. To all our members of the audience, thank you for your questions. Thank you for spending the time with us today. And then we'll leave it at that. Take care, stay healthy, and we'll have our wrap up now.
Mil gracias, Ángel, por la excelente moderación y la forma en la cual nos has ayudado además a conectar los puntos y entender el contexto del trabajo de los panelistas y sus organizaciones. Estamos muy agradecidos con Nelson Bocaranda, Cristina Burelli, Luis Marchal, Alan Martin, Julia Yansura y por supuesto a David Sud, nuestro último panelista, por las perspectivas que aportan a la conversación y a sus respectivas organizaciones por el trabajo que vienen realizando, aportando luz a un reto que solo se ha hecho más complejo y grande mientras sus operadores han estado trabajando en la opacidad. También, por supuesto, para Duncan Hill por ayudarnos a enmarcar la conversación con el estado actual del problema de flujos financieros ilícitos. Para ellos y para ustedes en la audiencia, nuestra invitación desde LTRC a tener conversaciones en más detalle sobre maneras en las cuales nosotros podamos apoyar el engagement de actores en los países involucrados, como por ejemplo apoyando procesos como los de Guyana y la presión de Canadá y Alemania, de la que hablaba Cristina, y de qué se puede hacer para impulsar un debate más fuerte con acciones concretas en otros países, o un enfoque en las necesidades de información y apoyo de actores locales. Reportes como el de la OCDE son fundamentales para tener claro el mapa de la cadena de valor e identificar los países en la región involucrados. Pero tal vez parte del reto es mapear también a los actores regionales en Venezuela y en los países identificados que pueden apoyar el esfuerzo de limitar estos flujos e identificar las brechas de información y de implementación de esfuerzos en curso. Esperamos poder discutir estas y otras ideas en más detalle en nuestro próximo taller y en conversaciones individuales y grupales en los siguientes meses. Últimos agradecimientos para el equipo de LTRC, en especial para nuestra investigadora líder Erin Fletcher y nuestra Deputy Director Robin Lewis por liderar este esfuerzo, así como Diony y Sol por apoyarnos con la traducción simultánea. Mil gracias a todos. Muchos saludos para todos desde Lima, Perú, y bueno, hasta pronto. Esperamos volverlos a ver pronto. Hasta luego.
Thank you very much.